Boys, we are back and we are talking about what we learned in 2023 and how we're going to use that to win in 2024. But before we get into it, make sure you're liking the video, commenting down below what you learned in 2023. One of the things we learned in 2023 is that when you hit that like button, that means you want us to succeed and you like the video that much more. You want to help the video spread to more and more new viewers, and we appreciate the heck out of that. And if you haven't yet, be sure to check out patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in on that 7-day free trial of the Discord. You can also get bonus podcasts. With all that said, all the promo in the books, let's get to the content that people came for. I'm kicking it to Nate first. Mike, you're going to have to wait. I apologize.
Okay.
But with that said, Nate, why don't you kick it off? What do you got here with your first thing that you learned?
So something I learned in 2023, which we've always kind of known, but there's an emphasis on it with how the NFL is now, is waiver wire pickups in the preseason really matter. Look, you can find the next Puka Nacua, the next Keaton Mitchell, who was a training camp standout for the Ravens. And while he didn't break out in the first 6, 7, 8 weeks, he was useful for your team later. Now, you might be able to find the next James Robinson. Those are guys we've seen before come out through that preseason waiver wire. Now, not every single person you're going to pick up on the waiver wire in the preseason is going to be one of those three guys. There's going to be a lot of Kayshon Bouttes. There's going to be a lot of Sean Tuckers, Zach Evans that don't really work out. But the thing is, you're trying. You got to try. You got to keep yourself in that competition to get those players that people aren't talking about, and then having that chance to have that upside, have that increase in valuation, and have productive players that you picked off the waiver wire after your rookie drafts, during training camp, during the preseason. Keep your ear to the ground and just turn over the bottom of your roster. Your taxi squad is not set until the first week of the NFL season, so make sure you're taking a look at your taxi squad and churning that as well. Like after the rookie draft, you get your guys in the 4th, 5th round, you throw them in the taxi squad. Most people just leave it be the rest of the offseason. They don't touch it again. But over the months of July and August, make sure you're looking at your taxi slot. All those guys still the best guys you can have in your taxi slot. There might be better players on the waiver wire, players that are starting to make some noise in training camp, make some noise in preseason. Take a chance on them. Constantly be looking for the next best thing to put on your taxi squad, to put at the bottom of your roster during July and August. Because a lot of people kind of check out from the waiver wire at this point, and they want to wait till the regular season when they start spending their fab. But hey, we know fab's good all the time. We want to use that in August to see what we can get, what kind of players we can get that are going to be a breakout. Let's be ahead of the curve, guys. What do you think?
Touching on just the taxi squad point you made, we've touched on this in the past too, of managing that taxi squad leading up to the season. And I think there's two ways to go about it. If you're kind of competitive, you stash that with players that you really just need to let cook for a year. You don't think they're going to do much. But you've brought up the point in the past, Nate, that I think is an awesome point, is if you're kind of a rebuilding team who wants a little more flexibility, you put players on the taxi squad that you know you're going to keep, that and the points are still going to tally up. We've learned through Sleeper now that the points that are on taxi squad still count towards your max points for if your league is determined by that, or the draft order is determined by that. But keeping the players that you know you're going to keep gives you some flexibility throughout the season to drop the Kayshon Bouttes, the Zach Evans, whoever it may be, to go get the Keaton Mitchells who pops off at some point if they're still kicking around on waiver wires, whatever the case may be. So I love this point. And, like you said, too, with giving yourself the chance, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So at the end of the day, Mike, I'd love to hear your follow-up to this point, or feel free to dive into your next one.
Let's not forget, part of the reason we play Dynasty is because we want to be more active the entire year. So that means that you should be picking up guys like this. And even if they never play a single game for you, but you flip them like Nate attested to, and you maximize your value. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that I took away is you can't just run it back. You just won the championship or came in second, or this could also apply to a rebuilding team too. However you want to look at running it back, being bad or good. You can't just be complacent and, you just won. Okay, great. I'm going to do it again. I don't need to do anything because I won. You're wrong. You don't want to try to repeat or rebuild with the same roster because things change rapidly. Even in Dynasty, we know as content creators that Dynasty, some of it's promoted as evergreen. That's not the case with content. That's not the case with your league either. So the way I implement that is you need to take an honest assessment of your roster. And the best thing you can do constantly in life and fantasy is being honest. What players should you move on from that are going to lose value soon if you don't move on from them now? Are there any value players you can get that might help your team? Because value is always good. And do you have enough draft capital this year and next year to put your team where it needs to be. If you won the championship, most likely you made some moves where you sold off some draft capital. So you want to try to get some back. If there's guys that you're excited about, and if you want to get more excited about those players, check out that free Patreon subscription, by the way. And how does your team stack up long-term against the rest of the league? Did you win the championship because a guy or gal that you played against was starting Nick Mullins and Easton Stick in the championship, and his or her team was just really banged up and you lucked into it? Okay. And, maybe get a roster review too. I don't know. There's a lot of things that you could do, but never just be complacent. Never just try to run it back. Always look to improve your roster and your team somehow.
Yeah, I think, staying away from complacency is the number one thing in the offseason, especially when you're a top team. It's easy to be like, hey, look at my team. I'm one of the best teams in the league.
Oh, yeah.
But we know that, over the offseason, valuations change like crazy. And it's not like it in the season where it's week to week. It's more like it's a couple weeks to a couple weeks over the month. But valuations change over the offseason. And if you have a competitive team from 2023, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a competitive team in 2024. So you want to be ahead. You want to be thinking about, hey, what does a competitive team in 2024 look like? And does that match what I currently have? Trying to get ahead of the game. You had a competitive team in 2023. That's great. But what does it look like in 2024? Trying to get ahead of the game and look at that. Always trying to be ahead of the curve because things change. And if you can get ahead, you're going to be that much better off.
Yeah. And I think just piling on of the concept of player situations changing, their production changing, as much as day to day, let alone season to season. There's just so much up in the air over the course of the offseason with incoming and outgoing free agents, incoming rookies, coaching changes, GM changes, whatever the case is. There's so much going on to affect the players' situation. And when you're in these cases, sometimes it makes sense to poke around where you might have players at similar values, but one's in a much better situation that can produce more or less, depending if you want to, like you said, Mike, before, rebuild as opposed to, run back the rebuild, quote unquote, or go ahead and try to run it back. There's just so much up in the air, and you have to assess the team, like you said as well. Maybe you sold out all your draft capital to try to win this year, and maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Either which way, it's just so unlikely that your team is going to need no upkeep over the course of the year. It's just, there's going to be something, there's going to be trades, and the thing to think about long-term is if you did sell out your draft capital and you don't have youth coming in, eventually you're going to hit a point where your team ages out. And that's why I don't love trading, all of my draft capital away for forever and just to get proven talent. Sometimes you can keep the youth rolling that way, but sometimes I've seen a lot with these sellout teams. They're willing to trade first-round picks for guys that are aging out in 1 to 2 years, as opposed to guys that, maybe sending 2 first to get a guy who's aging out in 3 to 4 years, kind of a thing. So love this point. You can't just take a look at your team and run it back. There's definitely some upkeep to keep in mind. So if you won your league last year, came close, you're definitely going to have to keep some upkeep because, as we say in the draft process, Nate, if you're staying still or not improving your draft stock, everybody else is passing you up. They're just getting that much more time to pass you up, catch up, and make it that much harder for you. But moving on to my point, one of my first things I picked up on this year, and another thing that's been kind of staring us in the face the last 2 years now, maybe even 3 years now, is backup running backs and backup quarterbacks matter. Because looking at quarterback, over the last 3 seasons, we've seen 41, 68, and 66 different starting quarterbacks throughout the NFL season, respectively. And per usual, we've seen plenty of running backs get injured that last multiple weeks throughout the season, if not the entire season. So it's time to take a look at quarterbacks, especially when you have room on your roster, depth spots available. And I would almost argue, instead of taking long shots, which you could argue that some of these are, filling your, roster slots with the Jake Brownings of the world, the CJ Beathard's, the Joe Flacco's, the Aiden O'Connell's, the Jaron Halls, the Taylor Heineke, the Gardner Minshew's. These are guys that we saw flipped for second and or third round picks in our very own Discord community. That's one of the cool things. We have a completed trades tab. So whenever people see trades or are completing trades themselves, they pop them in there. And then we just have a little bit more of a database to go through of completed trades. And the same kind of case for running backs now, with how many injuries are happening. Taking shots late round running backs in rookie drafts is huge. I'm not saying everybody's going to be Isaiah Pacheco or anything like that, but taking a shot on these guys who are the de facto quarterback 2 or running back 2 on their team that might not be getting a lot of run, that don't have a lot of value. And the really cool thing about these, in my opinion at least, if these options are not activated, meaning that they're not in their starting role yet, you can kind of just pluck these guys into a trade. You can just add them in as a throw in, like, oh, I'm, making this move for whatever receiver. I'm trading away AJ Brown and getting some, younger whatever asset. Oh, he has Jake Browning kicking around, or some second tier quarterback or backup quarterback, whatever the case is. Chuck him into the trade. I doubt many teams are going to balk at you for that. So unless they happen to be the handcuff directly to their quarterback, then maybe. But either which way, I just think that, not every one of these stash is going to turn into the bonus draft pick. But if you implement this, I think there's a nice little value side hustle to be had here, flipping these guys, and then ultimately improving your value bank that's on your roster and what you're working with as a team. Because if you can turn, these short-term assets, which they are, in my opinion, I think there's an argument to be made of these guys being, if they are a long-term backup quarterback, having some long-term viability value-wise. But I'll take a second-round pick over any of these guys any day. And like I said, we've seen these trades get done in our Discord, seen them in the DLF Trade Finder. You need to fill your quarterback slot with a superflex spot with a quarterback. Teams are desperate enough to do that. Mike, I'd love to hear if you have any additional points. You even put a note on here that you wanted to add something. So I have high expectations for this. What do you got?
Well, you guys know I love tight ends, right? And I know that's not necessarily the talking point here, but one of the things that I've seen, and kind of a shift in my mentality towards how I draft and I approach a rookie draft, is instead of taking players in the 4th and 5th rounds like Zach Kuntz, Payne Durham, and Bryson Hopkins, guys that I like, but reality might not ever produce anything for my team. I could have been taking guys last year like Brock Purdy in a later round, where, and I understand, when we draft, we always want to fill everything with, we want to fill every spot, bench or not, with potential starters. That's just not realistic. And Brock Purdy was the 3rd quarterback when he was drafted. And now he's going on a tear. So good for him. And instead of Payne Durham, I could have drafted Jaron Hall. Did Jaron Hall turn out to be anything? No. Could I have flipped him when somebody needed him? Yeah, I absolutely could have. And Bryson Hopkins, I could have drafted somebody else. I don't know. I don't remember. That was a little bit back ago. But, and then I've always been up for drafting these backup running backs like
Minshew. Drafted Gardner Minshew.
There you go. That's right. I forgot what year he actually came out. But then I've always been up for drafting guys like Zonovan Knight, Keaton Mitchell. These were guys that were relevant and that could have been flipped for some sort of draft capital when they were relevant. And, I do want to say, you guys know I'm a narrative buster. And Bob, to your point, backup running backs matter. Wouldn't that mean that the 2024 running back class is a good class then? Because we're saying, a lot of people are saying, and again, this is a bad running back class because there's no generational talent in it like Bijan Robinson.
I've said before we kicked to Nate here that this is probably one of the most valuable running back classes we've had.
For sure.
Because I can almost promise you any running back you draft in the 2nd, you're going to get a profit on. Maybe not all of them, but there's a very high chance of you can draft somebody and get a first for him later, whether you like the running back or not, or you just get a nice productive player. I think there's even that possibility with 3rd round picks because of how much people are talking down this class. Running backs are going to get involved. There's going to be, I'm very confident there's going to be an Isaiah Pacheco level talent in this draft that
easily
gets drafted day 3, doesn't get respected in rookie drafts, and then is much more valuable later. That's with how late they're being drafted and how late everybody wants to say that they're so bad, would not be surprised at all. I love the concept too of going after these, rookie quarterbacks and, running backs with your later picks as well, because I think with how many quarterbacks are starting, there's a good chance some of these guys are going to see the field. I think we had a record number of rookie quarterbacks that started this year as well, or we were very close to hitting that mark. I'm not sure that started a game this year. So
I believe you're right.
Nate, feel free to continue on or dive into your next point.
Yeah, my next point actually is kind of piggybacking off of this point, but specifically talking about getting handcuffs to your quarterback. We've always talked about, hey, handcuff your running back. That's a strategy that a lot of people like to use. More than ever in Superflex leagues, it is important to have a handcuff for your quarterback because there's about a 50% chance that you're going to lose at least one of your quarterbacks, if not both of them, at some point during the season. I personally have a lot of Tyler Huntley on a lot of my Superflex rosters because if Lamar goes down, I know I have a quarterback that I can put right into my lineup, still score me, 15 points a game, and I'm happy with that in my super flex spot. We saw it a lot this year where backup quarterbacks ended up starting nearly half of the season. Jake Browning, obviously one of the best examples. Jake Browning averaged 16.7 fantasy points per game, which was more than Sam Howell, more than Geno Smith, more than Deshaun Watson, Derek Carr, actually more than Joe Burrow, though I give him an excuse because he started out the year with that calf injury, and that definitely limited him. But having your handcuff quarterback just means that when your quarterback goes down, you don't have to go out there and spend $20, $30 in fab to get that backup. You already have it. Now, obviously, this is a little bit harder to do in smaller, shallower leagues where you can't just have a bunch of backup quarterbacks on your bench. But in deeper leagues, there is no reason in a 35 roster league, super flex, that you don't have 5 quarterbacks on your bench, because you hopefully have a quarterback 3 that's starting. And then you need to have probably 2 other quarterbacks just as your handcuffs or as your backups, because you're going to have at least one of those quarterbacks go down. We've seen it in the last 3 years. The quarterback position is becoming kind of similar to like the running back position, where we're just going to see injuries every year. It's just part of the game now with how many times teams are dropping back to pass. Player safety rules are changing, but I don't know if the player safety rules are actually, decreasing injury. We got to take a look at this, but what we can do right now is make sure that we have our backup quarterbacks. That way we're prepared when our quarterbacks go down.
I like this point a lot, Nate. And I think the biggest thing for me, outside of just flat out agreeing with the concept, I think what the quarterback landscape has kind of turned into is it's made me very cautious about wanting to buy into these high level guys, at least more than one. Like I want to have a centerpiece at quarterback for sure.
Of course.
And you can't avoid injuries. You can't play scared too much, but it really makes me hesitant when every year we see this, and we've seen this 3 years now where we've had, at least the last 2 years, we've had, really shocking numbers, having over 60 starting quarterbacks, 2 leagues worth of starting quarterbacks every single week or throughout the season, each season. But it makes me cautious to want to buy in on these guys when I can possibly find some piecemeal work at the quarterback position in my Superflex leagues. I had one league where between the season I had lost Justin Fields for a time, I lost CJ Stroud for a time, and I just so happened to have Taylor Heineke kicking around that I was able to chuck in for a couple weeks. Things like that, having some backups around, whether it's your own handcuff or not, I think is, a huge benefit. But all goes to show, having these extra quarterbacks kicking around, being cautious about maybe buying in on more than one big quarterback, because the more assets you're sinking into high-level players, and we know high-level quarterbacks are very expensive, the less assets you have to kind of play around and deal with the rest of your roster and fill other lineup gaps that we know are going to happen because injuries are going to happen. Mike, your next point kind of touched on this. Feel free to wrap up Nate's, get into yours. Yours is right in line with this and flows right into my point as well. So feel free to get on into it.
Not very often that you get to say things like, thank God I have Easton Stick on my bench. Things like that. But, to me, and I preach this all the time and I practice it too, depth is important. And like I said, I understand that, you want to fill every starting position on your roster and even every bench bench spot, I guess we could say, with a starter. But that's just not how it works always. But what I've been doing is with your roster, and do this before league play starts, fill out a starting lineup. Look at what players will hurt you the most if they miss time due to injuries or bye weeks. What does that lineup look like now? As Bob mentioned above, quarterbacks and running backs matter. So can you acquire any at a fair price that are going to help you when you need them? I'm trying to cheaply acquire players such as Devin Singletary, who we all thought it was going to be Dameon Pierce's backfield, and Devin Singletary came in and proved, hey, I'm a good running back. And Antonio Gibson, guy that Nate and I are both trying to buy cheap. A good example of that last year, prior to the start of the season, was Brian Robinson could have been acquired somewhat cheaply, as was Nico Collins. And you can't acquire those guys cheaply anymore. But depth is really important. And, it doesn't always have to be the sexiest player, right? It just has to be the most effective and efficient and the best value as well.
The more depth that you can have, and it's about finding players with the path to relevancy. It's not necessarily finding the starters. It's finding the players who are the backups in good situations, because there's a ton of backups out there. So how do you choose which backups to go after? Well, with the running back position, you're either looking for a backup that already has a little bit of a role that could possibly be expanded, a backup that might be younger and maybe could be taking on a larger role as the team invests in them.
Would be a good example of that.
Yep. And also, being aware of what running backs maybe are set up to have injury or, have a lot of wear and tear. taking a look at guys like Josh Jacobs, who we knew just came off a 300 touch season, he's bound to miss a couple games the next season. And he did. And look, if you had Zamir White, you're really happy with what you did. So, looking for those situations, and that's really how you find the best depth, is you take a look at those backups and you find the ones that have that path to significance, have that path to relevancy. And if you find those, that's where you can really get that return on investment on those depth pieces.
And I think what you did there, Nate, is you defined depth pretty well and what we're looking for in depth. And I think something I've seen and just maybe misconstrued in the space is that depth just equals players.
Yeah.
Depth is equivalent to bodies. Exactly. Just
everyone has the same roster spots. So that's not depth.
Yeah. I just think that too often it gets lost in translation, that depth just means having somebody that might be something someday. But especially when you're competitive and you're trying to, feel the starting lineup, focus on players that, like you said, have a path or are just affordable buys that you can slot in as a flex piece from time to time, whatever the case may be. Wraps beautifully into my next point here, Mike. You touched on it. You don't always need the sexy players, and it's not about your sexy paper roster in August. I have a question for you boys. How often is the team you started with in week 1 the team that's playing for you in week 17?
Never, ever, ever.
Very rarely.
The answer is never. Don't get me wrong. It's great to have a good starting point. That never hurt anyone unless you overinvested too many assets into getting that team and that you don't really have anything to play with to fill lineup gaps between bye weeks, injuries, and inevitable yearly disappointments, whatever the case may be. So my big thing here is you're going to have to work through the muck. You're going to have to buy players over the course of the season. So leave a little gas in the tank for the road ahead and know you're going to have to make moves that feel kind of gross and lineup decisions that feel kind of gross. There was a couple weeks I sat Saquon Barkley because, and that's a tough sit. Like, I know he didn't have a great season. It was, it might be, it's easy to sit Saquon, but it's like, no, it's not. Saquon Barkley is a guy who can pop off any given week. And, it's just one of those things that there's going to be moves that feel kind of gross. It is what it is. But, speaking of leaving a little gas in the tank for the road ahead, when there's a pothole, be willing to fill it in with just asphalt for the time being instead of feeling the need to rip out the entire road and start all over. Mike, you're a big anti-sexy paper roster in August guy, big pro-depth guy more than anything. But what are your thoughts here?
To your point, I don't know if you guys remember, I sent a text, this was a while ago, and they're like, hey, this is the point we're at in the season. I just sat Austin Eckler for Keaton Mitchell.
Yep.
So it's how it goes. And, don't be that guy that's bragging about, or gal that's bragging about how great your roster is in August, because every time I've seen someone brag about how great their roster is, their team is the first one to just take a massive dump all over the league. And now all of a sudden they're rebuilding. So yeah, I agree. And things change.
I think this is a great pairing of the point that we had with, you can't just run it back. You can't just run through the season with a great paper roster you had in August. Nate, anything else to add here before we dive into your next point?
In the offseason, you want to find ways to create more value for your team. You want to take advantage of value windows where you can buy, you can sell. And like you said, the roster, the sexy roster, that's great. But we also want to build the depth over the offseason. We want to invest in our team. I think people take the you don't have to set your lineup right now thing too literally in the offseason, because I get it. You don't need to set your lineup. So you're not strapped to go get that RB2 in the middle of March, but also you want to keep in mind your lineup when you're building a team, especially if you're building a competitive team. You need to have in your mind the entire offseason, hey, I'm going to have a competitive lineup. What kind of players do I need to make sure I have that really good lineup? And knowing that you need an RB2 does not mean you have to go out there and figure out how you're going to go get Jahmyr Gibbs or Bijan Robinson to be your RB2. It might mean you go out there and you get Raheem Mostert as your RB2 in the middle of March when he's super low valued. Keeping in mind those veterans, a lot of people don't want to go buy those veterans until August when you realize you have to start setting your lineup. But if you're buying those veterans in March, June, you're getting the actual value on them where you're getting them for cheap. You could get Raheem Mostert for third, fourth rounder in the last offseason. No one wanted Raheem Mostert last offseason. And here he is finishing as the RB2 on the season. You could have got him for so cheap if you were thinking about, hey, I have to set my lineup in 5 months, but I want to make sure I still have pieces to set my lineup, and then I can figure it out and continue to increase value between here and there. But also, I don't want to make trades where, I have 3 really good wide receivers, but I have no running backs anymore. I'm just putting myself in a hole. Sure, you want to get better players, you want to get bigger and better, but you have to set your lineup at some point. So don't put yourself in too big of a hole trying to go acquire better players. You want to make sure you have a full rounded lineup at all points of the season that you can at least move forward with. You can get those productive vets like James Conner, DeAndre Hopkins this year. James Conner was RB15. DeAndre Hopkins was wide receiver 20. Mostert, like I said, was RB2. Those guys, you don't think about them when you're not in lineup mode. So think about lineup mode in the offseason so you can get those great values.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I think it comes down to pacing yourself throughout the offseason. Yes, we have all the time in the world, quote unquote, to go and, fill the lineup gaps that we have, whatever the case is. But I think at the end of the day, when it comes to player acquisition, selling players, it all comes down to the value you can get for these guys. And right now, like you touched on, Nate, you can get these guys for relatively low values, relatively low costs because of the uncertainty of the offseason. And I tell you what, James Conner is definitely somebody I'm looking to go get because dude still looks like he has plenty of gas in the tank.
And he's still under contract.
Is still under contract, exactly. So, and with, we did it last year, and people do it again this year where they put this perfect, they have these spots in mind for where running backs are going to get drafted, and the team's going to look at the draft board and be like, why the heck would we draft that guy? So it's going to happen again this offseason. I love this point, Nate, pacing yourself and the concept of two working ahead. Because if you can work ahead of your league mates, that's been a theme this video too, is if you can work ahead, focus on the next thing, you can get ahead of values, get ahead of, poor trade situation, poor leverage situations. Like you said, if you're trying to trade for guys that people want to insert in their lineups, when it's time to insert them into your lineups, they're going to be that more costly. Just like right now, it's hard to trade for draft capital because people are looking right ahead at the draft. So tough to do during the offseason.
I love this, and I've been guilty of saying this, but also you would have been missing out on a guy like Adam Thielen last year. Just, don't take the sexy player, take the guy that's productive. He was extremely productive. I have been guilty of saying you don't have to set a lineup right now, and I do want to say that my thought process there is to not be forced into making bad trades when people are trying to hammer you and just trying to pull value out from under you.
Yeah. Like if it's July and someone's telling you, hey, you need an RB2, you have to take my player or else.
That is exactly my point. Right. Like, and I used to be in a league where this one guy was always like that. Like, you need this, so I'm going to do this for you. The ultimate used car salesman deal. But my whole thing is, and look, I'm a big proponent of it, and people have mocked me, and that's fine. Mock away. Weaponize your fab. Fab is an asset, just like draft capital, just like players. Use it to your advantage, and this is why I always ask for a couple dollars worth of fab in every trade, so I have the most. I've been doing this more and more. You have to temper some expectations. Of course, not every person you get off the waiver wire is going to be worth a first-round pick, but keep active, like Nate said, in the preseason, during the season, after the season, when things open back up. And especially in the season, what I do is I make sure I have a lot of fab, and then I pluck players off. I love to do this with quarterbacks in super flex leagues. Forgive me. So, hey, look, Easton Stick was just named a starter. He's not rostered. Or a couple years ago, PJ Walker was in and out of the lineup. He's a good example. I'll give you a good example. My buddy Johnny needed a quarterback, had injuries, had bye weeks. I saw PJ Walker was just named the starter. Again, this was last year. He had $10 in fab. So I bid 11 and I got him. I then flipped him for a third-round pick to Johnny.
Yeah.
That's how you weaponize your fab. And that's why you always make sure you have more. And of course, having a lot of fab, make sure that the lead up to the playoffs, because especially this year, and going back to Bob's point, all these different quarterbacks that we've had starting, you can make these outrageous bids. It is part of just what you have to use. So just use every asset that you have at your disposal to be productive and to stay winning. So weaponize it.
Yeah, I think
it's $3.
This is a really good point, Mike. And I think, we have made fun of you for including fab in your trades.
It's okay.
But, as the injuries go up at all the different positions and we have to play the waiver wire more and more in Dynasty, it makes more and more sense because, like you said, fab's an asset. And the more fab you have, the more dart throws you can take. And I think that's what is really important. Like you said, not every single person you pick off the waiver wire is going to, turn out to be anything. But if you just have more fab, then you have more freedom to make those pickups. I found that over the past couple of years, a lot of times I don't use my fab until the end of the season because I don't want to run out of fab. But then I'm missing out on some of the great players I could have picked up and helped my team. Now, if I'm trading for Fab in a couple different little trades and I have a bunch to work with, I don't have to be so stingy with it, which means I can take those chances on those players throughout the season and be competitive on the waiver wire throughout the season with the rest of the league and just give myself a better chance to find someone, and it's all about giving yourself a better chance to find value. How can you take advantage of what you have? And Fab is definitely a way that a lot of people don't really consider a genuine method to increase your team's value. But it's the little things that can make a difference, especially in fantasy football, where we know, like we just talked about, you're probably not ending the season with the same team you started with. So that Fab has become even more important. Yeah. Because in Dynasty, it was a while we didn't really play the waiver wire too much because we're playing in deeper leagues and you already have all the players rostered. But now we're seeing so many players play in the NFL over the season that it doesn't matter what league you're in, you got to play the waiver wire at some point.
Yeah, I like this point a lot, and because I'm a big fan of the adding to flip, because I realistically don't believe that a lot of these players are going to be long-term assets, and sometimes you may need them for short-term too. You may need whatever quarterback you pluck off the waiver wire. That's fine. I'm cool with keeping them. You don't need to flip them necessarily. Or maybe if you're picking them up as a non-direct replacement to your quarterback, and then whatever quarterback you needed coverage for comes back, then you can flip them to somebody else or something, especially after they have some rep under their belt. Of Jake Browning is a great example because he was the starter for quite a bit of time throughout the season. So, you could have filled in for whatever quarterback needed a bye week, whatever the case is, or a short injury throughout the season. Then you got an extra piece laying around that you could send for whatever draft capital you can. That's what I want to do. And to help with that, you can kind of see who else bids on this guy or whoever you're trying to get and trade to them for draft capital. Because the nice thing about Sleeper especially is you can see who all bid what, who did you just outbid. Start with the highest bidder, the guy who wanted him the most. Maybe their situations change if it's been more than a week, but either way, that can kind of give you a roadmap of who to target first. Or you just have a guy, you check the news, what quarterback just got hurt. Go to that manager. If they don't have a backup, hey, buddy, I got your help right here. Getting into my last point, one thing that I learned is to learn to separate your long-term starting lineup with the lineup you need to win games right now. And I think one thing, when we get caught up in this Dynasty real-life Madden GM mode, it's so easy to just get caught up in the long-term vision. I have this wide receiver in mind who I expect to be a wide receiver 1 on my team production-wise, or wide receiver 2 on my team production-wise. But when they're young, it's just not likely to be there yet. You're not likely to get consistent production. You're likely to get, some nice hopeful games, but games that let you down along the way. And when you're trying to win games, not as awesome to have on your roster. So it's one thing that, really this year to take a harder look and just, be willing to sit, the sexy rookie who may have a lot of upside, who may have long-term potential, a lot of long-term potential, but just, you look at a prime example, I think this year was Garrett Wilson, who had his fair share of good games, being pretty much the only real good receiving asset on that team for most of the year, if not all the year, but was just never really, had a lot of pop-off games. A lot of weeks he was, ranked in redraft rankings as, wide receiver 20-something on the week. When I'm expecting him to be in Dynasty, he's listed as a top 10 Dynasty wide receiver because value-wise, that's where he is, and that's where we kind of expect him to be. And I think learning to separate yourself from that, or separate yourself from those two worlds, is important. And something for me, I kicked all my redraft leagues last year. So I kind of fell out of the same routines of looking at weekly rankings and things like that. And, relying on more of my pulse on things and like, oh, well, I expect this guy to be really good. Time to get in there and be really good, champ. And that's just not, unfortunately, how it works as much as I wish it did. So, going into this, even if you don't play redraft anymore, maybe you do a little bit, you need to stay plugged into the landscape just so you have a really good gauge of, matchups and things like that. That is more than just the Dynasty aspect of having really good players that are going to be around for a really long time that maybe just haven't hit their start yet. So you can kind of separate that bias, that Dynasty bias of wanting to start your Dynasty wide receiver 2 for the long term, but really most weeks is at best maybe a wide receiver 3 or flex play, and maybe they play in that spot. Maybe you have other positions to kind of push them down the board, whatever the case is. But it comes down to the expectations you have versus what you end up getting if you're relying on your long-term Dynasty lineup to be a competitive lineup for your long-term. We talked about it a couple seasons ago now where, your sexy paper roster of all of the highest ranked rookies in Dynasty didn't win you a championship. The Javonte Williams of the world, who at the time was like running back 3, the Kyle Pitts in the second season, who was, ranked as a tight end 1, obviously, of course, why wouldn't he be? But I think the big thing to take away here is that don't be afraid to lean on some aging vets to help supplement a competitive lineup while your rookies or younger players are still finding their groove in the league. It takes time. Not everybody's going to be a year 1 breakout. We know that. We like to see some production. I think too often people get caught up in, well, they need time. And really it's just like, well, it's just not going to happen. Like, get over it. But there is a middle ground to be had there. And I think supplementing with some aging vets, or just not even aging vets, but just older players who just can still slot in, but might not be high in Dynasty rankings. Don't get the two twisted. When you're setting a weekly lineup, you got to consider more the redraft aspect of things and where people are ranking in this week's rankings, because that's one thing we see a lot is there's a lot of discrepancy between a weekly or yearly redraft ranking and a Dynasty ranking. So when you're expecting players to pop off, might not happen if they're low in redraft rankings. So it's just something to keep in mind, something to think about. Mike, yeah. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Nate, I'd love to hear yours as well. And then we'll get on out of here.
I love this. I think it's a great point, Bob. Well done. The other thing I have to add it to is don't subscribe to narratives you see online. Make sure you always do your own research. I mean, of course, we appreciate you guys listening to us. You got to look into things for yourself too. But Bob, well said. I really don't have much to add aside from that.
Yeah, Bob, I think you made a great point when you said this isn't Madden GM mode playing Dynasty. It's the closest thing we can get to it. But in Madden, yeah, you go out and you get like the 70 overall rookie, and then you put him in your starting lineup because you can control it. You can go out there and throw bombs to him, and you can go catch it because you're playing like on rookie or something like that. But in Dynasty Fantasy Football, we don't control the results on the field. We don't have any control over the results on the field. So, yeah, you want to go out there and you want to put JSN, you want to put Jahan Dotson into your starting lineup. And those guys, as talented as they are, they're just not going to score fantasy points. Meanwhile, guys like Mike Evans consistently is going to score fantasy points. We have this dynasty mindset, and that's how we value players, and that's good, especially helpful over the offseason. Remember, Mike Evans, prime example of this, because he's still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Next year, he's still going to be one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. So Mike Evans, his value is going to drop over the next month or two, but he's going to be a great asset because 6 months from now, he's going to be scoring fantasy points for your lineup. He's going to be in your top 2 or 3 wide receivers. That's kind of the player you need to go out and understand. I don't control everything with just like the young rookies, the young exciting players. I need to make sure I also have this supplemented with the productive players who we know are still really good, but just because we're always looking ahead, we're devaluing a little bit as a community.
I think that's a great point. And, we always talk about looking ahead and looking towards the future, but I think that's one time where don't be afraid to look at the now, look at what people are producing currently, and so on and so forth. Love that add-on point, Nate, and love all the points that were discussed here today. If you loved all the points that were discussed here today, I hope you leave a like, comment down below what you learned in the 2023 Dynasty season. We want to know, and we definitely want to see you in our Patreon Discord, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that free 7-day trial, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to learn more from us over the course of the offseason, get into some rookie content, rookie mock drafts, all the things you don't want to miss it. Subscribe if you're new, subscribe if you're watching and are not currently subscribed. That's a big no-no. But with that said, we're going to get on out of here. For Mike, Nate, myself, that's going to be it for us today. We'll see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.
Also, I think sometimes people get caught up a little bit too much in the, you don't have to set a lineup until September. Did you guys just see
what
that?
The just happened?
Happy birthday!
What?
That was incredible.
It was when you did the Cody fingers. That's when it happened, wasn't it?
It was. Can I do it again? Congratulations!
I don't.
What
that was incredible.
Well, I guess the computer update worked.
We keep computer updates really cool, I guess.
Quite festive.
I don't know how to do that again, but if I figure it out, I'll let you know.
Bob, please don't edit that out.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll put it at the end as like a blooper.
Yeah, you should.